Welcome to a new Energy Capital interview. I'm Anna, and today I'm very happy to talk with Lucy Kessler, clean energy expert working as a steel lead with the Center for Climate Aligned Finance and manager with the Rocky Mountain Institute. Lucy will talk with us about the challenges of decarbonizing the steel sector and the ways in which capital providers can help companies in this regard, mainly in their efforts towards a clean energy future. Lucy, it's great to see you today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
That's great, Lucy. So without further introduction, I'll start with our questions. Lucy, to start with our topic, could you provide us a quick picture of the steel sector's carbon footprint globally?
Absolutely. I'm happy to. So yeah, steel is the largest industrial source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's responsible for about 7% of global emissions. To put that in perspective, this is roughly equivalent to the total annual emissions of India. And so while there is a Paris Agreement for the countries of the world, there isn't a Paris Agreement for a lot of the industrial sectors that are high emitters. And so that's why we're doing the work at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance to support these high emitters in reaching their climate targets and reducing their emissions. One additional thing I would say is that while steel is responsible for about 7% of global emissions today, steel production is only expected to grow in the future. There's a projected increase of about 55% of steel by 2050 compared to 2010. And that's largely due to projections around development of emerging economies. Driven in large part by the use of steel as a key building material. It's also used in infrastructure and in automobiles. So as the rest of the world develops, the use of steel will only develop further.
Lucy, mainly considering how steel is produced, why is it so hard to decarbonize this sector in contrast with the transportation sector, for instance?
Yeah, great question. So steel is one of the hard to abate sectors, meaning that there aren't existing viable alternatives or cost-effective alternatives for sectors such as steel. This is largely due to a few different reasons. One is producing new steel from iron ore requires a huge amount of heat, as well as what's called a reducing agent. Basically, what that does is it takes the oxygen out of iron ore to turn it into iron, which then can become steel. This reducing agent has historically been coal, but instead of coal, the opportunity is to use hydrogen. And so that's the cleaner alternative. However, hydrogen is not yet cost effective for steel producers, and it needs to be available in large quantities in order to support the needs of the sector. And so that's why the steel sector is largely considered hard to abate. For a portion of steel, it's actually produced using recycled steel or scrap, and that uses electricity mostly for its production. So there are more readily available alternatives for the production of recycled steel through electricity, because you could use renewable energy, of course. But it's that primary steel or new steel that is really hard to abate because so much of it is reliant on the use of coal.
And following on this, Lucy, why is it important to acknowledge the particularities of this sector in the energy transition, since it is very hard to decarbonize it?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to recognize the challenges so that policies can be developed to help support the industry transition. When you think about like some of the largest emitting sectors, like the utility sector or transport sector, there are alternatives that are available. But for these hard to abate sectors, we really do need the policy support for R&D and to develop the technologies further, as well as the policy support for pilot plants. So there is a pilot plant in existence that is developing steel using hydrogen. And so more of those types of pilot plants are really important to help the sector transition.
What would it mean to close active steel plants before the end of their useful lives? And similarly, do you know of any efforts you have mentioned some of them, but more efforts in creating a green steel market?
The transition of the steel sector to decarbonize it effectively could require, as you noted, closing or decommissioning some steel plants before the end of their useful lives. This, of course, would result in stranded assets. This might happen in some instances. In other cases, there is an opportunity to transition what's called a blast furnace from coal to natural gas, and then eventually to hydrogen, or to use something like carbon capture and sequestration along with the existing blast furnace. So there are opportunities to retrofit the plant rather than to decommission or take it offline. And then, as I noted with electric arc furnace, there's the opportunity to just switch the type of electricity, which wouldn't result in the decommissioning of the plant. In terms of your question about efforts in creating a green steel market, this is something that is underway and has been initiated in large part due to the Mission Possible partnership. This is a partnership that the Center for Climate Aligned Finance is a partner of, and it's comprised of 16 organizations that are all working to help decarbonize these hard to abate sectors through various approaches or strategies. So that is through engaging finance, which is what we do at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance. It's through engaging policymakers and governments. It's through engaging industry to pledge to reduce their emissions. And then it's also through engaging customers, so some of the largest buyers, to really send a demand signal to industry to tell them, if you make this, we'll buy it. And with the steel sector, there is not to date green steel on the market. This is a commodity. And so there isn't a way that like you as a customer could go and buy a car and say, I want the option that has green steel. But the idea is that by having these large automobile companies say to the steel companies that they would make cars with green steel, this would send an important demand signal to the sector. And actually, on that point, there's one cool example of a recent agreement between Volvo and a steelmaker, SSAB. They've signed a collaboration on research and development to commercialize the world's first vehicles that would be made of fossil-free steel. We're also seeing a lot of demand from the construction sector because over time, as the grid is becoming greener, the carbon footprint of buildings is shifting more to the embedded materials in the building and less from the electricity use in the building. And so architects and builders are recognizing the need to decarbonize or find alternative materials and resources. And so we are seeing a number of large construction companies or building companies saying that they want to be able to purchase green steel, which, as I noted, you can't go out and purchase today. And so both the construction sector and automobile sector, as well as public procurement from governments, could be three really important voices in demanding green steel.
And from your experience with the Center for Climate Aligned Finance, what role can capital providers like banks and financial institutions play in helping the steel sector decarbonize?
So increasingly, we're seeing large financial institutions set climate targets. And what I mean by that is they're pledging to align their investments, their portfolios, and their loan books with climate goals. However, I think financial institutions are recognizing that the global economy is not 1.5 degree aligned. It's more like 4 degrees aligned. And so it's one thing to make these commitments, but it's another to actually have the investable assets that are available and out there to invest in. And so what the financial sector what we at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance do is we work to support the financial sector in partnering with their clients in the real economy. As I said, there's a limited universe of investable assets. And so the option really is to understand how hard to abate sectors like steel are planning to transition, and providing the support that they need to do that.
For instance, in the shipping sector, we have the Poseidon principles, which were adopted to assess and disclose whether banks' ship finance portfolios aligned with their climate targets. So could a framework like this be adopted among steel financiers?
Yeah, so that's exactly what it is that I'm working on at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance. There was a lot of interest in the Poseidon principles after those were launched, and the number of signatories has grown. It's doubled since the agreement was initially signed. And what we're seeing is financial institutions are coming forward and saying, well, this is great that this is for shipping, but what about Poseidon principles for other sectors, like aviation or like steel? And so what we're doing at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance is bringing together a group of lenders from some of the largest lenders to the steel sector to have them develop an agreement that supports the steel sector in their transition. This work is being led by ING and Societe Generale. They are the working group leads. And then other working group members that have joined include Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Standard Chartered, and UniCredit. And these 6 banks have come together to say, we want to design what this standard would be for decarbonizing the steel sector, so that we can support our clients in this transition. So the lenders will come together. They will identify what that standard would be and identify a methodology by which they can assess and evaluate if their clients are working towards those climate targets or not, so that they can get a better sense for their loan book, to understand if their loan book is aligned, and if it's not, how much more work do they have to do? How much further do they have to go? In addition to this working group, we have several steel companies that have expressed interest in joining this effort. There's a review group of 10 additional banks, and there's an expert committee that brings in existing organizations and initiatives that are already working in the space. And so we're amassing this large group with growing momentum and growing urgency and excitement as we work to develop something by COP.
Well, Lucy, many thanks for sharing with us and our audience this brief but very interesting picture on the challenges that the steel sector will need to address to decarbonize, and also the role of financial institutions and organizations such as the Center for Climate Aligned Finance in helping them. So could you like to share a final message with our audience in this regard?
Yeah, so at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance at RMI, we are working with several of the largest financial institutions and supporting them in identifying opportunities to work with their clients to decarbonize and achieve climate targets. So you can learn more at climatealignment.org and follow us on social media. And yeah, I would say we're working on launching this agreement for the steel sector by November at COP. So stay tuned to learn more.